Well, let me welcome you all to this event. My name is Professor Thomas Pangle. I am the co-director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for Study of Core Texts and Ideas, which is the great books program, undergraduate program at the University of Texas. Many of you will be familiar with it. Anyone who isn't, I'm going to leave some brochures at the front, and you're free to take those and learn more about it. Among other things, we have an undergraduate book club, which is open to anyone. All of our courses are open to anyone in any school in the university. And if you'd like to know more about the book club, that'll be on these little sheets that's also part of that. Again, open to anyone. We also conduct a lecture series during the year, bringing lecturers to campus and having distinguished lecturers from the University of Texas, like this event. And in particular, each year we have the responsibility for mounting the University of Texas's celebration of Constitution Day. Today is September 17th, the anniversary of the presentation to the world of the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia by the framers after the long secret meetings over the summer. And the United States Congress has seen fit in its wisdom to mandate by law that every university in the United States that receives federal funding must celebrate this day with an intellectual event. So you are helping our university to comply with federal law. And this is our event. And we're very happy at the Jefferson Center to be sponsoring it. And today we're especially pleased to have as our distinguished speaker one of our great teachers and scholars on campus, Professor George Forgie, who is a prize-winning teacher and most distinguished scholar of American history, particularly of the American Civil War and its period, and of American constitutional history. And today he is going to favor us with his reflections on Abraham Lincoln and the Constitution in the Civil War. George.
I want to thank Professor Pangle, Tom Pangle, Professor Lorraine Pangle, for inviting me here to give the lecture for Core Texts, and I'm glad to see we're obeying a federal mandate, which raises certain constitutional questions, I suppose. I'm going to be trying to make an argument here while we're together, and it's fine with me. And if you fall off the wagon at any point, you're not going to get back on probably. So if you have any uncertainty about what I'm saying, if you want clarity of any kind, please wave your hand. We're a small enough group that that'll work. If I think it's something that's going to take a little more time and that we should discuss, I might push you off to I understand we're going to have some question and answer time afterwards. But it begins with Lincoln, and it begins with the observation, which is pretty common, that Lincoln is generally recognized as our greatest president. I'd say that's the consensus among historians and probably the public as well. But he is also the president who went closest to getting outside the Constitution, to stretching the limits of the Constitution. And in fact, the word dictator is sometimes applied to him. So here you have a man who's the greatest president, and yet in our society where we don't like dictators, he is called a dictator by some people. And I want to investigate that. Looking in one way, it seems that when he wanted to do something, Lincoln, when he wanted to do something, he did not let the Constitution stand in his way. And certainly that's what people were thinking when they called him a dictator. He wanted to do something, they say, he does it. He does not let the Constitution stand in his way. But looked at in another way, which we're going to do, he can be understood as adhering to the Constitution, faithfully adhering to the Constitution, rather than doing things that large segments of the public thought it was in the interest of the country to do. Namely, specifically, as I'll hope to show, abolish slavery. While I was preparing material for this talk and reading in literature, the vast literature about Lincoln, the Constitution, the Civil War, and so forth, I kept coming to this point. It's a cliche, it's a convention among historians to say that Lincoln abolished slavery. No, he did not. He emancipated slaves. That's an important distinction I want to have clear. Historians commonly say that with emancipation, Lincoln changed the war effort from union, which is what he started out with, to abolition or to emancipation. Now, we can get into, I suppose, a word game here, but I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that to Lincoln, it was very important to insist to his dying week that his only object was to save the Union, and that what he did about slavery was a means to save the Union. Let's see how that holds up. While I'm talking today, I'm going to be referring to certain passages in the Constitution, and I thought the best way to get rolling with that is to give you a sense of the way Lincoln thought about the Constitution, described his understanding of the Constitution. And as he did, as I'm thinking about how he did, what are Lincoln's criteria for understanding what's constitutional or not constitutional? Sometimes he'll rely heavily on the text. Sometimes he'll rely heavily on the intent of the framers. He once said, the intent of the framer is the law. And sometimes he will just act as though the Constitution is a system as well as a document, a system. And in fact, I looked up on my online dictionary the word Constitution, and although the second meaning, or the it's never been on? All right. Do we have anybody here from tech? Do you know how to make it show? So it's never been up, right? You haven't seen anything up here. This man is from nuclear physics, or astrophysics. He knows how to do these things. All right, I looked up the word Constitution in my online dictionary, and you see in the bold type, the Constitution, a basic written set of principles, our document. But above that is a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. And sometimes Lincoln, when he's talking about the Constitution, gives you the sense that that is what he's touching base with, not the text or not the intent of the framers. What he understands the system, the framer system, and that's a term I'll use, to be about. And here's how he would go about describing what that system of the framers is or was. In the Revolution, I'm trying to be careful with my words here, the fathers, he never said founding fathers, the framers, the fathers, the founders, created a nation, and they organized it politically and constitutionally as a union of states. By the way, Lincoln used nation and union and also government sometimes interchangeably without seeming to be concerned about the distinction. A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's from the Gettysburg Address. All right, they created this. And then in 1787, several years after the Revolutionary War ended and we got our independence, they made a more perfect union by writing and getting ratified the Constitution. And that Constitution, among other things, did, I'm going to mention two big ones, A and B. A, it created a national government with certain sovereign powers. Now, national, for the people who went to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, at least for the first few days of it, and for Lincoln, had a distinct, precise meaning. A national government is distinguished from a confederation government in that a national government can operate directly upon the people. Directly upon the people. Whereas under the Articles of Confederation, the government we had was a government that acted upon the states, interacted with the states, which then acted upon the people. Here we have a direct link between the government and the people. It is a national government. And the powers it had were the powers that most sovereign nations had at the time, given to it by the Constitution, including, Lincoln always believed, if need be, the power to save itself. And the power to save itself, he called, others had called it, and it became generally called the war power. Lincoln invoked the war power. Now, what is the war power? Well, I look for some quotes about the war power, and you immediately run into mist and fog. One prominent lawyer in 1861, after Lincoln had used the term, said the war power is, quote, whatever our conscience and the consent of Christendom, according to the modern laws of war, would justify. I know no other limit to the war power. Our conscience, Christendom, modern laws of war, which he didn't spell out. What are those? Another commentator in 1862, the government is restricted, in using the war power restricts the government only by the vast and vague rights of war, of which its own military necessities must be the final judge. All right, that is the national government with the power to do that, use the war power to save itself. That's A. And B, a government that left almost all control over almost all local institutions and concerns to the states, to the control and jurisdiction of the states, including the institution of slavery. The Constitution protected slavery, and we can go into that later if you like, not by using the word, but by referring to it in unmistakable terms with euphemisms. The Constitution protected slavery, and what its references meant, at least by 1820, to American politics, the consensus of politicians, and Lincoln accepted this, was what I call in one of my courses rule number 1 in the Constitution. When it comes to slavery, a state can do what it wants. When it comes to slavery, a state can do what it wants. Lincoln accepted that, believed that, and I would think I could argue and get away with arguing that he believed that until his dying day, which is going to create some questions. In order to get a government that was national, point A, in Lincoln's view, the framers had to limit its powers in point B by restricting certain powers to the states, and especially the power over slavery. We have a national government with great powers, but they do not extend to doing anything at all, interfering with, touching slavery. That was the bargain. Lincoln believed this. I don't know whether it's true or not, how true it is, but he bought it. The framers lived and worked in a slave-owning society. Some of them owned slaves. They called slavery an evil, a regrettable institution. They marked it for death. That's why they didn't use the word slavery in the Constitution. The first time, by the way, the word slavery appears in our Constitution is in the amendment, the 13th Amendment that abolished it in 1865. It's not there beforehand. Lincoln believed that this was a necessary bargain to get the Union. But, that is, we have this Union, and in time we'll get rid of slavery. And they put in the Constitution a device to do that. And that device doesn't get that much attention. It shows up in Article 4, Section 3. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Here is the basic distinction I want you to understand. The framers reserved to the states all power over slavery in the states. But Congress has power over the territories, those areas west of the states that we look forward to becoming states. Congress has the power over the territories. Territories are provisional states, prospective states, states in waiting, states in training wheels. And what's going on with them is this. If you can keep slavery out of the territories, they'll never become slave states. But even more, here's a recipe for getting rid of slavery. And I probably can come back to this later. Slavery, 19th century people agreed, was either growing or dying. And these orange states, by the way, are slave states. The green ones are free states. The yellow are the territories at the time the Civil War started. And slavery is growing. If you can stop it from growing, here's what's going to happen. The soils which produce the riches for the slaveholder will start wearing out. The slave population is healthy. It will keep reproducing. The income of the slaveholder on his property will go down. His expenses to take care of the slaves will go up. It becomes an intolerable situation. He can't sell his slaves because there's a surplus, there's no market. And eventually, the slaveholders themselves, within the state control of slavery, will dismantle slavery. That is this notion of how the founders, in Lincoln's view, saw slavery ultimately dying. Another way that occurred to him and others is that these territories out here, if they don't have slavery in them to begin with, will become free states, and sooner or later, 3/4 of the states will be free, and they can change the Constitution to abolish slavery. So there are ways out. He liked this system. And in all of his life, I think it's fair to say he worked to preserve it, and when it was in danger, to save it from destruction. Now, if that is the idea here, that we set up this system with these powers, these restrictions, these possibilities, it didn't work out that way. Because if you studied the first 60 years of the 19th century, what you know is, first of all, slavery did not die. 6 years after the Constitutional Convention adjourned without expectation, so-called, the cotton gin was invented, and suddenly people could get very wealthy growing cotton, exporting cotton. And slavery took off. It extended into those orange areas, and new slave states were created. And they had power in the Congress. The slave state leaders controlled the Democratic Party and were able to control the government. Did you know that up until the Civil War, from the day one in 1789 to the time Lincoln became president, a majority of Supreme Court justices came from the South, from slave states? Even though increasingly the South was a minority in population. Most speakers of the House were from the South. A majority of the presidents came from the South. Their power in the government was out of proportion to their numbers, to their wealth, and certainly, in the view of many Northerners, to their moral value. Lincoln was one of the people of his generation who were bothered by this. The founders' vision was being perverted, distorted, ruined, overthrown. In 1858, in his famous House Divided speech, the point of the House Divided speech was this: we are going to become either a free nation all the way or entirely a slave nation. And he said, at the moment, the danger is the latter. We will become an all-slave nation as the institution spreads and the political leaders of the Democratic Party in the South work to spread slavery westward, ultimately not only into the territories but into the free states. And the only way this could happen, this does not get attended to very much. You hear all kinds of talk in this political campaign about people adhering to conspiracy theories about this and that every day. Lincoln said there was a conspiracy afoot. This is the point of the House Divided speech, a conspiracy afoot to spread slavery. And it is up to his new party, the Republican Party, of which he was a founder, to stop that. The goal of the Republican Party, and it took its name from this, was to restore the system of the early republic, to put the Union back on the basis on which the fathers left it, before it had gone off track. That is the goal of the Republican Party, to put the system back in place. Once you have righted this, put it back on the track properly, let it go, it will do the job eventually of getting rid of slavery. Lincoln believed that. He was nominated by the Republican Party in 1860, and he won. And he always believed, it seems, that the election to him vindicated the program of the Republican Party that slavery must be put back on the road to ultimate extinction, and he would proceed to bar it from going into the territories while protecting its existence where it was, and we'll see it die. By the way, there is something disingenuous about this notion of we will protect slavery in the states. We have no power in the central government to touch slavery in the states. The states can do what they want about slavery, but it cannot expand to the territories. It's a little bit like saying to a child, a 2-year-old child, visualize this, a 2-year-old child, a 4-year-old child, dear, wonderful little child, I'm going to protect your existence. I will go to the end of the earth to protect your existence, but you will not be able to grow. I'm going to put an iron casing around you and you will not be able to grow, but I'm going to protect your existence. That is, I suppose, a gross, but that's a way of putting it. All right, that's what Lincoln expected, but of course he is thrown off this plan, apparently, by war. And I think it's fair to say he didn't expect this. He thought the threats of secession and war were humbug, were efforts to coerce, extort concessions out of the North. But here's what happens in 1860 after Lincoln was elected. First 7 and then 11 of these orange states seceded from the Union, left the Union. Ultimately, some of them stayed in the Union. Little Delaware up here under Pennsylvania, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. There were 15 slave states, 11 of them seceded and formed the Confederacy. And they demanded that Lincoln give up all federal property, all U.S. property inside these orange states, inside the Confederacy. And one property in particular became the focus of this tension, Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, flying the U.S. flag over a fort in the harbor of the most Confederate of Confederate cities, Charleston, South Carolina. And Lincoln would not give it up. And on April 12, 1861, the Confederates bombarded it and seized it, thus beginning the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The United States versus the Confederacy. All right. Now, Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, developed a strategy. And it's quite detailed, but I think I can give you an overall summary of it very quickly. It was to cut off from the rebellion as many of its resources and sources of supply and support that he could. And in the course of doing that, he issued a series of proclamations. I don't know of any other president who's issued so many. He's the great proclaimer, whatever else he is. He issued a proclamation imposing a blockade, a naval blockade on the South. Why? Because England might otherwise give it help, bar that from coming in. He will issue a proclamation offering a pardon to white Southerners. Why? To draw them away from the rebellion, the lukewarm or the people who've had enough, to limit the number of rebels. And he will issue a proclamation suspending the writ of habeas corpus. I want to go into that. And, of course, the most famous of all, the Proclamation of Emancipation. The proclaiming president. All right. The first is this. I want you to picture this. We're in 1861. The war has just started. It's April. Lincoln is in Washington. He's been president for about 6 weeks. By the way, he never managed anything larger in his life than a law office with a few clerks and maybe or maybe not his family. He had no administrative experience whatsoever. And suddenly here he is doing this. He has to improvise, but he came up with this, the strategy I'm talking about. But he is in Washington, D.C., which is between Virginia and Maryland. He's worried that Maryland will secede, and if so, Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the North. There were Confederate armies outside D.C. Who knows whether they might attack? a Confederate army of 8,000 troops outside Washington, D.C., had 1,600 at max in D.C., spies perhaps in Washington, D.C. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. What does that mean? It can be very complicated, but to be very simple about it, let me put it this way. If you leave here today and go on your way home and are arrested, you have a right to get a lawyer who will go to a judge, and the judge will order a writ of habeas corpus to have you brought before the judge to see if you are held legally. And we start the process of due process, that is, indictment, trial, et cetera, et cetera. Lincoln suspended that, which means that he can arrest you without explaining why and hold you wherever for as long as he wants. And the text, of course, for this is Article 1, Section 9. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So that's what he's basing that on. And he used this argument. Look, I am in Washington, D.C. Congress is out of session. Who knows what's going to happen? I can't wait for the ordinary processes of arrest and trial to deal with the danger. I have to clamp down on anyone I suspect. And so he did. And then in 1862, the great proclaimer proclaimed the suspension of the writ over all of the United States, northern states, Confederate states, which he of course thought were his, for any unpatriotic action very vaguely defined. It was up to him. Now, when he was asked to explain and justify how he could do this, he cites this passage. And I want to ask you a question. Here's where you can chime in. I guess you'd have to be a junkie, you'd have to know this. When Lincoln was attacked for suspending the writ, and his answer was, look, the Constitution says I can suspend the writ during a rebellion. We have a rebellion. What is the argument that indeed he cannot do it, that he's acting unconstitutionally? Does anybody happen to know? Yeah, in the back.
More or less, Article 1, Section 9, Article 1 defines the powers of Congress. Therefore, it's actually congressional power by the terms of the Constitution itself.
Exactly, and you have to know that. Article 1 is where this is, Article 1, Section 9. That is the article of the Constitution that sets up the powers, lays out the powers of Congress. Article 2, the executive, the president. It's in Article 1. And in fact, historically, in England, as people pointed out to Lincoln, the writ had never been suspended for centuries by anyone other than Parliament. Abraham Lincoln was the first and so far the only president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus without congressional authorization, hence the charge of dictator. And he used this textual argument, but what's interesting to me is that when he would have a political figure arrested for unpatriotic speech, discouraging enlistments in the army, Lincoln used a very homely example. He said, when a young man deserts from the army, I have to shoot him when we catch him. Must I shoot the ignorant soldier boy who deserts and not lay a hand on the wily agitator who inspires him to desert? Lincoln would make an argument about the Constitution in homely, everyday terms to have the public understand it. So he would use the text. He'd say, there's nothing in here that says I can't. That's a textual argument. But he would also use the common sense argument. I didn't know what I was up against, or this man is getting in the way of harming the war effort. And then, so that's the first one. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Very controversial, charged with dictatorship. And the second, of course, was the Emancipation Proclamation. I've told you that Lincoln did not abolish slavery, but he did emancipate slaves. Fitting in with his strategy of depriving the Confederacy, the rebels, of their labor supply, his argument is essentially this. Nobody complains when I kill a rebel. Nobody complains if I take a rebel's horse or tear up his railroad tracks. Nobody complains if I seize a rebel and hold him as a prisoner of war indefinitely, but somehow or other I can't take his slave? Again, notice this homely common sense argument that he makes. There's nothing in the Constitution that says I can't do it. And ultimately, he made a statement that I think captures, and here's a key to everything I've been saying. I'm sure I have it. I will recite it for you. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. Let me repeat that. Notice the breadth of this claim. He said this in 1862. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. And you can read into this, any measure which I think may best subdue the enemy. Any measure. There's no limit. And he is the judge, the sole judge of that dictator. Which suggests that even if the Constitution had explicitly said that the president could not suspend the writ of habeas corpus, he would have said, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, which we're in, I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. And by cutting off the support from sympathizers in the North who might sabotage my war effort, I am doing that. So it seems pretty blanket, pretty carte blanche. If we engage in a word association here, the word dictator would probably not be far away from these activities. All right, I just want to be clear here. I've tried to present this image, this understanding, this impression of Lincoln as dictator. By the way, here's the outline for the lecture that I thought was up there before Bat Sparrow turned on the lights. There's the statement I was looking for. I want that to be clear that this is what he thought he could do. But having made that point, and I hope clearly, I'm now going to back away from it. There's another story here entirely. And it's going to seem like a contradiction. He did not abandon. In fact, he continued to adhere to his lifelong belief that the institution of slavery could be dissolved only under the terms of the original bargain that I described earlier. The states have complete control over it. And he acted on that belief, carrying on the errand of the framers and the Republican platform that elected him in 1860. And here's how he did it. If the states have complete control over slavery, I'm willing to endorse that. In fact, I think this is probably one of the least known facts about Abraham Lincoln. In his inaugural address, he announced his support for an amendment to the Constitution, proposed amendment, that had just passed Congress in the last couple of days before it was inaugurated. It is called the Corwin Amendment after one of its sponsors. And it says, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize to give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with slavery. It's simply putting into the Constitution in explicit terms this line I've been giving to you, that he thought the federal government had no power over slavery in the states. And not only that, notice this, it's an unamendable amendment. No amendment shall ever be made. This amendment passed the Congress, and it was ratified by 3 states in 1861, including Illinois, Lincoln's home state. Imagine if that had gotten into the Constitution. It would have been the 13th Amendment. He was willing to guarantee complete state control over slavery. The federal government could not interfere. At the same time, however, notice what he was doing. He met with the only congressman from the tiny state of Delaware, and he said, I want Delaware to take the lead in dismantling slavery. I beg you to do it, and I will pay you to do it. We will use federal money. You have the decision to make. I want you to take the lead. He's going to a state, you have all the power, I want you to take the initiative and do this. This, in Delaware, where there were only 1,800 slaves, most blacks in Delaware were free, this proposal was so unpopular in Delaware it never even entered the legislative process. That was 1861. In 1862, in March, Lincoln went to Congress and he said, I want you, Congress, to pay for the slaves in any state that will agree to abolish slavery. I want gradual and compensated emancipation paid for by the federal government, but at the voluntary discretion of the states. Again, adhering to this notion the states have complete control, but I want to encourage them. And he made this argument more than once. The war in a day, a month, 3 months, costs much more than the value of all these slaves would cost if we paid to buy them, for you to liberate them. That got nowhere. The border states rejected it. These slave states that are still in the Union. In April 1862, the Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. Lincoln was fine with that because it's not a state. In June of 1862, Congress abolished slavery in the territories. Lincoln had all along been calling for this. He signed that. Immediate, uncompensated, he approved it. Then he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, so we don't expect him to talk like this anymore. But he did. In December of 1862, 2 months after he'd issued the preliminary proclamation warning what he was going to do, and weeks before he finally issued the final Emancipation Proclamation, he went to Congress and he asked for a constitutional amendment by which the federal government would pay for any state slaves if that state agreed to get rid of slavery by 1900. Gradual and compensated dismantling of slavery. But again, the states are in the driver's seat here. They have to accept this carrot that he's holding out to them. In 1864, when Congress passed a law abolishing slavery, Lincoln vetoed it. You have no power over slavery in the states. This is over a year after he'd emancipated slaves. In 1865, he sent his Secretary of State Seward to meet with some Confederate emissaries, and Lincoln finally went along with him, as you might have noticed in the Lincoln movie. His terms for ending the war were, 1, the restoration of the national authority through all the states, national government. Number 2, no receding by the executive, me, on the slavery question. No receding. The Confederacy was on its last legs. The 13th Amendment, which we're going to come to, had been passed, the one abolishing slavery. And all he can say is, my terms for your ending the war are no receding. That's not quite new birth of freedom. And number 3, cessation of hostilities. by you, and the war ends. Those were his terms. What's going on? What is going on? He used the war power to emancipate slaves and used this conventional path that the fathers had envisioned to abolish slavery. What I'm trying to do here, I hope you see, is distinguish between emancipation, which he thought he could do, because taking away their slaves takes away their labor support and adds to ours, and only to our troops. By the way, do you know that on the day the war ended, there were more black troops in the United States Army than there were any kind of troops, i.e. white troops, in the Confederate Army? Lincoln always believed that blacks in the United States Army made the difference in Union victory, and he says that could not have happened without emancipating them, offering them freedom first. But he won't abolish slavery. Why was he entitled to do one but not the other? There's plenty of evidence to suggest that he could have gotten away with doing it. Plenty of evidence. The radicals, these are the members of his party, and they're also abolitionists who urged Lincoln to abolish slavery, emancipate slavery, thinking the public doesn't really understand the difference. The war power lets you do it. Wendell Phillips, the greatest of all, one of the greatest of the abolitionists, says, whatever the people want and is necessary in wartime is constitutional, you can do it. The conservatives, the people who said, no, you can't, who called him a dictator, you don't have a right to do this, they tend to be Democrats and people without a party at the moment from the border states who are in ill repute because they used to be the buddies of the rebels and are now probably their fellow travelers and sympathizing with them and hoping they win. They said you can't do it, but they have very little standing to complain. One of those opponents of what Lincoln was doing raised another point, and that is the public. Public opinion would have given Lincoln a blank check here. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he quoted a New York newspaper saying, quote, nobody pretends that this act is constitutional, and nobody cares whether it is or not. The Emancipation Proclamation, nobody pretends that it's constitutional, and nobody cares. The public, by all accounts, and I've spent some time studying this, the public opinion, by which, by the way, Lincoln was quite in tune with, was willing to do anything it took to save the Union. And I'm going to read one quote to you, because I think it captures it as well as anything that I've seen. This is from a moderate Republican newspaper in Massachusetts. In the summer of 1862, the war had been going on for over a year. The American people, listen to this blanket statement, the American people are determined that the nation shall remain one. However long and expensive a war may be necessary to reestablish national unity. The alternative is not yet presented. But if it does come, we shall not hesitate to say, listen to this, if it does come to this, we shall not hesitate to say, perish constitutions, perish states, perish local institutions, perish everything, but the national unity must be preserved. And I could haul out many, many other quotations to the same effect. Another commentator, the people see the government overstep what are generally considered its constitutional limits every day, and they rejoice. Another, a person who wrote in a letter to the New York Times, why doesn't Lincoln go further? If this country needs a dictator, ought to have one. Common to hear this. So, the Constitution, I would suggest, and if I were listing my 5 main points, this would be one of them. The Constitution was in great danger. And it was in great danger during the Civil War because the people were willing to sacrifice it in order to save the country. And Lincoln knew this. And Lincoln knew this. But still, he wouldn't abolish slavery. I don't know how to explain this. I can label it self-restraint. But maybe there's a clue in this text that I have up here when you look at it again in core texts. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. What are the joker words here? In time of war. Not all the time. In time of war. Any measure which may best subdue the enemy. If I cannot make a connection between subduing the enemy in war and what I would like to do and what you urge me to do, I cannot do it. I can emancipate slaves to take away his labor supply, but I have no authority under the Constitution to make on my own authority permanent rules for what is property in a state or not. The Emancipation Proclamation liberated slaves, but it did not touch the institution. There was nothing in the Emancipation Proclamation that would have prevented the people who lost their slaves to emancipation someday from going into Maryland or going into Kentucky, which was not subject to it, and buying new slaves. He didn't touch the institution, at least not legally. So, Lincoln seems to have believed that if he could save the Constitution, to save the Constitution, he could do anything he needed to do. But to change it, he could not. He could not change the system the fathers created. Emancipate, but not abolish. And I want to show you, and I'm going to ask you a question here. I have an illustration of this distinction. In a change in the text from the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd to the Emancipation Proclamation, the final version, January 1, 1863. Does anybody see a difference between what Lincoln does in those two texts? All persons. Do I have a volunteer who will read it out loud? You, sir. Read out loud the first one.
All slaves and persons who shall hereafter be engaged in rebellion against the government of the United States shall be forever free.
How long will they be free?
Forever.
Okay, well now read the second one.
All persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free.
How long will they be free?
Shall be.
Henceforward. I think that tells us something. He can't make permanent property arrangements. Now, we can finagle about the words. Of course, they're going to remain free forever. He's not going to send them back. But he thought making that change was important. Thank you. Thank you. I have the authority to do whatever I need to do to save the Union. All right. I don't have authority to change the Union, which brings me to the last thing I want to do. Lincoln, as I said in the flyer that lured you here today, said in a very famous statement, I would save the Union. He said it over and over again, I would save the Union, I would save the Union. No one ever asked, I don't see historians ask what he meant by that. When you ask people, as a historian interrogates them, what do you mean by union? I see at least four major answers. Well, I want to save the Union. I want to save the geography of the Union, the territory of the Union from coming apart. I want to save the territory from coming apart. Another one, when I say I want to save the Union, I want to save the government of the United States from a rebellion seeking to overthrow it. There's Lincoln. I want to save the Union as it was meant to be, free of slaves, and that's the only way to save the Union, is to get rid of the problem that endangers it. That's the third one. And I want to save the Union that the Constitution created that is being endangered by that tyrant, despot, dictator, Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. He's the only danger to the Constitution, which is the Union, which is what I want to save. 4 basic differences. I want to save the territorial integrity. I want to save the government. I want to get rid of slavery. I want to save the Constitution. I want to save the Union. Lincoln wanted all of these things. Where he differs and is distinctive, and I'm tempted sometimes to say we were lucky to have him, he understood the concept of priorities. He didn't believe that the territorial integrity of the United States was ultimately in danger. He said this more than once. You can divide the country temporarily, as the rebels want to do, but the geopolitical reality is, look at the map, we are stuck together. It will come back one way or another. The Constitution's in no danger. You say, the only danger you can see is me, and I know I'm not. He's not worried about that. The Constitution will be fine. And slavery, if we put the American system back where the framers left it, slavery will die in due course. But the rebellion seeks to overthrow the government. Again and again and again, in ordinary speech, meeting this person, meeting that, and most emphatically in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln doesn't mention the territory of the Union, he doesn't mention the word Union, he doesn't mention slavery, he doesn't mention the rebels, he doesn't mention the Constitution. But he does mention government of the people, by the people, for the people, which he thought was in danger of perishing from the earth. Here's what happened. The rebels are the people who lost the election of 1860, and the only time in American history this has happened, hope it's going to continue that way, the loser in the election rejected the result and rose up and rebelled against the government. If they are successful, our system is destroyed because elections then become opening bids. The result can be contested by force. No election result will have any validity or safety, solidity after that. And they want to rebel to overthrow the government. They're rebelling to overthrow the government. If I let that happen, if we show that popular government, which elected me to run it, cannot enforce its laws and put down a rebellion, in which case it's as good as dead. Our system cannot endure those assaults. So, if we can save the government, which is what I'm doing, and why I think I'm entitled to do anything I need to do that, that will, in the due course, that will along the way necessarily save the territorial integrity of the country. Slavery will die because the system of the fathers will be put back in place, which is the constitutional system. He wanted all of these things, but he wanted one of them first and most urgently. Okay, I think that's a guide to what Lincoln was about. But of course, the anti-slavery radicals say, the danger, Mr. Lincoln, the danger in all of that is that this war will end with all these hundreds of thousands of people dead, and slavery will still exist by your scheme. Lincoln was fine with that. Again, there will be no receding by the executive. He was fine with that. And this, I think, is what produces the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The anti-slavery radicals believed and urged Lincoln, you have the power under the war power to abolish slavery. The public would have gone along with that. We probably would have forgiven him for that. But it was very important for him that slavery die within the constitutional system. And so we have a compromise here between the people who want slavery dead right away today, and Lincoln was willing to let it go till 1900, in the 13th Amendment, the centerpiece of the movie Lincoln. It's kind of a compromise. It was passed by the Congress on the 31st of January 1865 and ratified by the states by December. Lincoln didn't live to see it. Slavery was still legal in the country when he died. But what it brings me back to is this concluding point. Lincoln did not abolish slavery. The American people abolished slavery through the Constitution by a constitutional amendment added constitutionally.